大家好，周六的晚上好，感谢大家跟我们一起陪伴周六的晚上。我是 IvyCompass 的 CEO 索菲亚，非常高兴跟您度过一个非常有意义的晚上。那么按照惯例，我还是用中文来提前介绍一下我们这个平台。大家已经非常熟悉了哈，我们 AFI 是一个 non-profit organization。我们的宗旨呢，就是让我们大家能够聚集在一起，通过知识分享来提高我们整体的群体素质。那今天晚上的 hosting 呢是 IvyCompass，中文叫指南针教育咨询。我们的宗旨呢是将北美口碑最好的前藤校招生官，包括今天晚上的 Professor Ahn，还有一些独立的升学顾问、艺术作品集等等一系列的教育资源对接给我们全球的华人。此外，因为 IvyCompass 是 AFI 旗下的一个分支，那我们很高兴还会有一些定制化的志愿者的服务的一些机会，还有社会影响力、科研、实习等等背景提升的项目。我们特别看重的是，在升学这个过程当中，等于用这个杠杆这个平台，在正确合适的导师的指导下，通过这样的一系列的过程，能够提高我们学生的整体的思维方式、思想高度和格局。那这样的话呢，他们不但达到了能够在12年级申请大学的时候进入理想的大学，同时能够锻炼他们的组织能力、时间管理能力和跟成年人打交道的能力，从而学会一些好的 business practice 和一些软实力。所以，我们机构相对来讲会特别的注重在整个过程当中去 monitor 孩子们在这个升学的准备过程当中，让自己不但是有竞争力，同时还能够全方位的提高自己的个人能力。这样的话，等到了大学以后呢，他们就更知道怎么样有的放矢的用 strategy 更好的方式去让自己获得更加多的成长。这是我们一个比较特殊的地方。那2025年和2026年有很多家长问我们今年已经招生的结果哈，陆陆续续都在有结果进来。大家可以看到，我就不一一的这个列举了。那么看到所有的这个哈耶普斯马，还有 UPenn 几个藤校，包括也有的孩子去了 NYU 啊、BU 这些学校都有我们学生的影子啊。这个是 multiple 这个导师的这个结果啊，非常可喜。那再着重的分享一下我们 IvyCompass 的刚刚这个，我点到了一点点我们的特色，因为我们每年是控制学生的数量，我们的导师也控制他的学生数量，所以我们是要将质量把在一个 priority 的一个 position 上面，我们确保有一定的时间和一定的精力分享给每一位学生，确保他们足够获得足够的 tension。所以我们不仅仅是去所谓的增加的数量，无限制的增加数量，而 dilute。在整个过程当中对这个质量的把关，所以这一点是我们的特色。我就always 跟家长分享，我们非常开心，be happy to be steadily，不想做大，就想做一个认真好好的把这几位学生能够认真的把他们在这个过程当中去给他们一些更需要得到的一些 tension 和一些细节的把关。我们在跟家长的沟通上面，我相信有一些跟我们一起走过这个过程的家长也会，跟大家来这个做这样的一个 reference，他们就觉得我们还是挺关心每一个孩子在个人能力上面的一些成长和一些友好的提醒啊。同时，因为我们的导师他是一个由于数量的控制能够做到的一个垂直式的服务，也就是说，他们从签约到这个申请结果的4月份。这个导师是常年跟踪这个学生，有的是3年，有的是2年，有的是1年，不管时间的长短，由于这个导师当中是不更换的，不像有一些大机构，他的这个写作老师和你的这个课外活动的设计老师和他的主规划师是不一样的人，在这样的一个流水线的过程当中，有的时候信息是会被这个遗落的。那这个垂直式的服务，这个导师一直跟踪跟到您这个申请大学这个整个的这个申请过程为止， 那由于是这样的一个方式，所以相对来讲，我们的导师跟我们的学生是一个非常深入的一个了解。等到申请的时候，在写文书的时候，有很多的信息他们已经很熟悉了，就变成一个水到渠成的事情这也是一个我们这个非常看重的一个方面。另外呢，IvyCompass 指南针呢，就像我刚刚说的，跟 AFI 这样的连接，所以我们还有一些 YAFA 呀，还有我们很多优秀的学生去了 Stanford，去了这个 MIT 或者去了 UPenn 的 Wharton School，很多是从 YAFA 锻炼过来的一些青少年，因为这个 YAFA 这个组织是AFI 旗下专门搭建的，让孩子们自己组织的一个 leadership 的一个association。那这样的话呢，他们由于进一步的能够通过自己的努力去做一些自己组织的 conference 和赛事，从而获得了很多的领导力的锻炼。那第四步，当然我们也刚刚说了，特别注重孩子们的个人成长。如果您还没有关注到我们的网站，欢迎您去看一下我们一些 sample 的这个counselor 有不同背景的这个导师。那今天晚上的 Professor Ahn 也是我们一个非常受大家欢迎的，有很多很多的经验的。我等一会儿着重在这个分享一下他。同时，你看到我们还有很多艺术的 art。photographer, music, economic, civil engineer, physics，很多背景提升的导师都在帮助我们的孩子获得这方面的提升和成长。那今天晚上呢，再一次我就着重介绍一下我们邀请到的这个 Professor Ahn，他是一位 UPenn 宾大 UPenn 商学院和 Emory 大学的招生官和审判员和面试官。他同时也在 Pepperdine 很多的这个大学做过招生的工作，有大量的 evaluating 学生的这个经验。他的这个内容也是受到大家的这个非常大的这个热度和追捧。他今天晚上跟我们大家分享的内容，第一个是2026年申请的这个结果的一些复盘，同时还跟大家分享作为一个招生官。他在这个看学校和这个了解evaluating学生过程当中，来告诉我们大家到底这些好的学校在找什么样的学生，有哪一些因素在我们亚裔的录取过程当中扮演了更重要的角色？因为大家都知道，竞争更加的激烈，因为好学生特别的多哈。同时在这个录取数据背后的信号，2027年我们将如何需要调整一些策略？那么今天晚上我就非常高兴把这个 floor give to Professor Ahn. Now I'm going to stop sharing. Now everyone attention to your presentation. You'll be able to share your screen. Let me stop mine.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sophia. So while I'm trying to get the technology straight to share my screen. Thank you again for having me here. Sophia, please tell me if I'm running over time, because I, of course, want to make sure that we leave time for questions. And so with that said, I've got a short presentation. What I wanted to talk about was, so far, all of the colleges are neck deep in applications, of course. And so I think what's interesting is for rising seniors and for students who are currently 9th and 10th graders, and then even students who are about to start high school soon. I think there's some really interesting things to be inferred so far from what's going on in this application season, and also what the expectations are for next application season. So I think hopefully tonight will be helpful for current 11th graders who are rising seniors. So you've got your summer coming up, and then you're going to be applying. And then I think this will also be very helpful for 9th and 10th graders in terms of, again, your summer, and you have another year, your most important year, your junior year, and then you'll be applying. And then I like to think I'm going to try to make this helpful for people who, even though it seems like it's way down the future, if you're a 7th or 8th grader right now, it's actually not as far down the future as you might think, okay, based on what the current and the expected trends are. So that's what I wanted to talk about tonight. So let me go ahead and share my screen if I may.
Yep.
Okay. And Sophia, are you able to see the presentation slide?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay,
I do.
perfect. So what I'm here to talk about tonight is new trends for the upcoming 2027 cycle. So that means when the seniors apply this coming fall, where the deadlines again are November and December generally, and then those are early deadlines, and then the first week of January 2027. So those are the deadlines that we're talking about. Some of the trends, there are about 6,000 colleges in the United States. And so obviously there's not one single school that's a trendsetter. But what I've noticed over the years, over 10 years plus, is that it seems like some of these top colleges that have very low acceptance rates, especially your Ivy League schools and similar schools. And I put the monikers, the insignia for all 8 of the Ivy League schools, but then also for MIT and Stanford as well. So those are 10 of the schools that we generally focus on. But of course, I personally am familiar with about, I'd say comfortably at least around maybe 110, 120 colleges. Those are the main colleges. I'm also a member of some major associations, and these associations are very helpful in terms of a lot of us who are involved in admissions, sharing a lot of ideas. And again, I get a lot of, I think, helpful information just talking with so many other admissions people in especially these schools, the 10 that I was talking about. The trends that I'm going to just at least generally address for tonight, they come from both sides. Okay. The colleges, we have our own trends that are going on in terms of how the admission cycle's changing. So I'll talk about those trends. And they're mostly these 3 things. From the student's point of view, there are also some trends that I think are going to affect the way you continue your high school career, or if you're a rising senior, the way you're going to do your summer and then apply. Okay. And so the bottom line is I want to end tonight's discussion with what I suggest that you do if you're a rising senior, a 9th or 10th grader right now, or if you're about to start high school. Okay. So with that said, there's a couple things. One of the biggest trends I would say is that colleges are becoming more what I would call back-ended or selectively back-ended. And what I mean by that is there's generally 3 stages for you to get in. And this applies generally for all 6,000 colleges in the United States. There's a filtering process, and this is usually computer driven. For example, what's your SAT? What AP exams have you taken? And then even things like, do you have disciplinary issues? Do you have excessive absences? These are all like data points that can be easily filtered out. Assuming that your application gets through that stage, there's an assessment stage. This is where an army of individuals will start dividing and evaluating parts of your application. So for those of you who are rising seniors are probably already familiar with what's going to be in your application for the fall. But for those of you who are not yet rising seniors, you should know what the components of your applications, what an application is. That way, you don't turn into a senior and you go, oh, wait a second, I have to write about 10 different activities? I didn't know that. Okay, so in the assessment stage, again, you have an army, you have somebody like me who might be assigned to read, say, if I'm your essay evaluator, I might have to read about 2,000 essays that cycle. Or if I'm your teacher recommendation letter evaluator, I might have to read around 3,000 or 4,000 teacher recommendation letters, and so on. If I'm your transcript reviewer, then I'll have to read about 800 to 1,200 transcripts, and so on. And each one of these components is assessed in a pretty meticulous and methodical way. For example, the transcript, when that's evaluated, usually it's scored based on your course selection, the GPA somewhat, and then the commensurate standardized test score that goes along with that. Okay. And so each one of these components, all the way down to your activities, as I said, the teacher recommendation letters, your essays, even the interview report, all of these components get assessed and they get scored. Usually they get scored individually. Okay. And so, like I said, this is where human beings are actually doing the evaluation. It's a subjective process, yes, but it's nothing compared to the third and final stage. So assuming your application gets past this assessment or scoring stage, then it goes to something that most colleges call committee. And in committee, this is where, again, somebody like me and usually 2 other people or 4 other people, with some schools it varies. Some of the Ivies use 7 people total and so on. But this is where a committee will literally review the application, the scoring, a couple of components. The components are weighted differently. But the whole point of the trend being that colleges are being more selective and more selectively back-ended, what that means is this third and final stage is becoming all the more important. It does not mean that you don't have to worry about your GPA or your SATs. It does not mean you don't have to worry about your activities or your teacher recommendation letters, etc. What it actually means is this is where the most weight in terms of how you get in is applied. The important thing about the first and second stages is that if there's a question, for example, about your ability to perform in courses, suppose you're taking, instead of taking AP, say biology, instead of taking honors chemistry, you're taking on-level, say, language arts, and your on-level GPA is a C minus, okay? There's going to probably be a question now about your ability to perform. If you have too many of these issues on the filtering stage, your application will not even get to the scoring stage. The same thing happens in scoring. If the different components of your application don't score enough, for example, suppose your teacher recommendation letters, they score low, or perhaps your essays score low, and so on, then your application won't get to committee. Okay, so the whole point is you still have to perform well, but the most weight is unfortunately in the most subjective area. It's subjective, meaning we have to make personal judgment calls. Okay, I mean, consider this. We have to read a teacher recommendation letter, or usually 2 to 3 teacher recommendation letters. We have to read essays. We have to infer what kind of person you are based on your activities and so on. It's purely subjective. Speculative means we also need to try to predict in the future what kind of alum you're going to be. So the question is usually 2 parts. What kind of student are you going to be, or what kind of person are you going to be when you're with us for 4 years? And then what kind of person are you going to be after you graduate for the rest of your life? Because you're supposed to personify the best of what that college has to offer. With that said, a lot of the things that we look at are why you do things and how you go about doing things. And this I'll emphasize at the end of the talk for tonight, because, a lot of, I'd say, applicants, unfortunately, in my opinion, or in a lot of people's opinions, they spend a little bit too much time worrying about what they're doing or whom they're doing it with, where they're doing it, et cetera, rather than why and how. Holistic means that everything is looked at together, and I'll talk about that in more detail in a minute, okay? This is really an explanation of how subjective, but how important the judging final stage is for you to either get accepted or not accepted, okay? So in terms of what the current situation is now and what we expect the future trend to be, I know this is very difficult for you to see in terms of the data, so I'll try to expand it. But before I expand the view, I think it's clear this goes from 2012 all the way up until just this last cycle. Okay, and I think it's clear that 2 things are happening. The percent acceptance rates are all going down, and then they're all going from wide to narrow. And so these are the 10 schools that I was referring to. Cornell traditionally may empirically have the higher percentage acceptance rate, but it by no means means that it's any less selective, okay? But in the big picture, a lot of top colleges, Duke, Johns Hopkins, University of Chicago, and so on, UC Berkeley, et cetera, a lot of these schools, they're very competitive. And if I were to put some of those schools on the scale, you would see how low these percentages are, okay? And the main thing that's driving these, unfortunately, is the size of the applicant pool, and also the quality of the applicant pools in general seem to be getting even more competitive. With that said, let me talk a little bit about how holistic the process is. So this is something I mentioned a minute ago. Okay, so one thing before I talk about holism is standardized. These are a couple trends that are happening that myself and a lot of others have noticed. One thing is that standardized testing is becoming increasingly important. So here's a tip. If there's a college that says that the SAT or ACT is optional, do not interpret that as Oh, good. I don't have to take it anymore. Okay. I can explain later if somebody has a question as to why that's the case. But the standardized testing is actually becoming more important. 12 by 5, 12 by 5 refers to a kind of student who took 12 AP exams and got 5s on all of them. Okay. We see a lot of 16 by 5ers. As a matter of fact, I've worked with a high school student who was a 17 by 5er. Okay. So being a 12 by 5er, it's not as special as it used to be. Again, that does not mean that the AP exam is not important. Conversely, it actually means that it can be even more important, because when we assume in an applicant pool, everyone is about the same in terms of standardized testing and certain other more quantifiable statistics, okay, then we can focus on the judging part, which is more subjective. So that's why I was saying of those 3 stages, the judging is all the more important. A 16 by 36er, this is the student that we often refer to who got either a 1600 on the SAT or a 36 on the ACT. Again, it's not what it used to be in the 90s or in the 2000s, unfortunately. Okay. The other trend that a lot of us are seeing is that the colleges are becoming a whole lot more selective. And that's because I mentioned the applicant pool is becoming a whole lot more competitive. People are doing research earlier. They're doing internships earlier. The level of their involvement in the activities is becoming, I'll say, it's increasing at the level of responsibility and impact. The personal development is something that is, again, maybe we will discuss this in the Q&A, but in terms of the, how does a high school student show maturity in a way that a college wants to see it, especially in final committee? That's a big question. The size of the applicant pool I mentioned is getting larger. It's also becoming more diverse. A lot of that has to do with international applications as well. Okay. And then another, I'll say, general category of trends, I would say, is that the due diligence that colleges are doing is becoming more rigorous. Due diligence is just how rigorously does the college vet or evaluate the student. So fine, the student might have some activities. You're president of this, you're co-founder of that, you're a member of this and that. But that's not taken on face value like it was many years ago. Now we look at, oh, you were president. Well, what did you do as president? How did you become president? As president, what are some things that you did incrementally beyond what the president is already supposed to do? So those are examples of how things are becoming more rigorous. And so getting back to what I said earlier, one of the mistakes that I and a lot of others who will look at an application think that we almost think is tragic is that a lot of students will focus too much on the what rather than the how and the why. And so, for example, oh, I have to become president of this club no matter what. But then they don't really do anything in terms of that higher visibility as president. As a matter of fact, a lot of times it's better to not be an officer and actually have more impact on the club or the activity. And I can talk about that again in case there's any questions towards the end. Couple of the specifics. Interviewing is taking on some interesting changes. So there are 3 general categories. A lot of colleges are increasing their emphasis on the importance of interviewing people. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because if everyone has the similar SAT, everyone is a 12 by 5, or they're similar with their APs, they're similar with activities, etc., how are you supposed to tell the difference? Okay. And so the interview is one of those ways. I said there are 3 general categories of schools that view interviewing. So the first category is the schools that really put emphasis on interviewing. Another category is schools that are trying to replace interviewing with videos. And this is more for, I'll say, expediency's sake, because, for example, like the Ivy that I work with is University of Pennsylvania. And so this year I can't give you the official number, but we got over 50,000 applications. Well over 50,000 applications. Our goal has always been to interview everyone who wanted an interview. Okay. And actually we hit that goal 4 or 5 years ago. We hit 100%. A couple of years before that, we were in the mid 90% and so on. But then we realized, what is it about the interview? We just want to get a chance to interact with you on a face-to-face level. Okay. And so a video, a lot of schools are now experimenting with videos. Like Brown, for example, is an Ivy that actually does allow videos. Yale has experimented with it. My school, of course, we've been toying with the idea for many years now. And so the video alternative is something. The other thing is that there's a whole lot more training with the interviewers. Before, there were some schools, I won't mention which Ivy was doing this, but they were even using actual students, undergraduate students, to interview. Okay. Those days are long gone now. And so even the alumni interview, the alum interviewers, they go through a whole lot more training. There's more of a vetting process. It's a lot more structured now. And so one of the big trends is this interviewing. And I mentioned that there are 3 categories of schools that view interviewing. The third category, so the first was, it's very emphatic about it. The second was the video alternative. And I'll say the third is they're viewing interviewing as something that's very selective. In other words, there are some colleges that, and again, I don't have official data to prove this, but just in discussions with a lot of other admissions folks from other schools, it seems as if they do not want to grant an interview to just anyone. And so depending on the evaluation of the applicant thus far, then they'll decide, okay, we want to interview. So in other words, for some schools, it's possible that getting an interview invitation is a good sign because they actually want to know more about you, or they feel like they want to verify certain things, or they want to confirm what your application is already making them believe. And so it's possible that when a school does not interview you, it's a sign that they're basically saying, we've already made up our mind. We don't need to know more about you. We don't want to spend the time and effort to do it because we already know the answer. Okay, so that's the third category. Couple other trends, and I'll move along, Sophie. I'm sorry if I'm taking a little bit too much time, but supplemental information, this is becoming a new trend as well. So deferral loci, these are letters of continued interest. Deferral locis are nothing new. Okay, so if you get deferred after an early application, a lot of times they'll give you an opportunity to send more information. That more information is becoming a lot more important. In the past, it generally did not. I would not say that it is extremely important yet, but it is becoming a lot more important. There are also parts of the application that give the option for supplemental information. For example, MIT is a great example. So they gave you an opportunity to do an artistic maker portfolio if you wanted to. Of all schools to show off how good of a musician or dancer or artist you are, MIT? Absolutely, yes. Okay. My school, Wharton, for example, you have an opportunity to show that you do a whole lot of things that may have nothing to do with business or finance. Perfectly fine. Okay. So the supplemental, that goes beyond now. Just in the past, the only supplemental really was you might get an option to provide a supplemental recommendation or a reference letter. Now the supplemental aspect is the trend is that's becoming more important. There are also some this is an interesting trend too. So there are some schools that will now ask for just more information. And that generally is a very good sign. Okay. It's not part of the deferral process. This is usually part of the regular decision process. So imagine as the 12th grader, you filled out your application, turned it in for a regular deadline, and then 3 weeks later, you get an email asking, is there anything else you'd like to tell us about yourself? Okay, so that's becoming more common. Okay, rescissions are also not as rare as they used to be. A rescission is when a school rescinds the acceptance. It's usually an early acceptance. So imagine again, you're a 12th grader, you submitted, you applied early, either ED or EA, and then you got accepted. And in the middle of your, how jubilant you feel during the start of the next semester, you get an email in, say, the end of January, beginning of the middle of February, that says, we're concerned about your performance. Can you give us an update all the way up until, and then it'll say something like end of February or March or something. Or in the worst case scenario, they'll say, we believe there was some sort of an issue with your application. Upon further review, please contact us. And then that might end up actually with a rescission. And unfortunately, I've worked with students where that situation did come up. Luckily, at least so far, I've never had a student where the rescission went through and the acceptance was rescinded. Okay, but that is this is happening. This is not as rare as it used to be. And then there's subjective differentiators. So the trend is that these are becoming more important. An SAT, if 5 people score exactly the same, say 15, 20 on the SAT, you can't tell the difference between them based only on that. Okay, but a recommendation letter, an essay, an interview, these things you absolutely can tell the difference. Okay, activities. The final trend I'll mention, or I think is worth mentioning, is activities. The committees, and this is along the lines of more rigorous due diligence. You need to be able to evidence what it is you're doing with your activities, and so that's something that also I think it just shows that there's a trend towards admissions committees becoming even more rigorous, even more meticulous. They're having to use finer, toothed combs, okay, to vet applicants. It just is a reflection of how competitive things are. This is an example of, or this is not an example. This illustrates, at least based on one survey, okay, or a couple of surveys and mixed with a little bit of research, about how important certain parts of the application are compared to other parts of the application. And this I find to be useful because a lot of times I'll work with a student and they'll say something like, Professor Ahn, I Googled, does the essay matter in my application? And it said no. And then they Google it again and it says, yeah, it matters a lot. And they do that with a lot of things. And I think what's important to note is it depends on where in the application process you are. So, for example, I think the simplest way to separate it is this in stage 1 or 2 or in stage 3? So remember, stage 1 was the filtering, stage 2 was the scoring, and stage 3 was the judging, okay? And so if you might remember, I was saying the judging, that third and final stage, is really the most subjective, heavily weighted stage, okay? But what does that mean? Before committee, test scores like the SAT, that matters a lot, okay, in your filtering and your scoring stage. If your application makes it to final committee, nobody even looks at your SAT. Nobody even cares about it. And the thinking is, if we had a question about your GPA or your course selection or your ability to take tests, then your application never would have made it to committee in the first place. Okay. Now, I'm not talking about every possible situation, but again, just in general. Okay. Same with activities. Activities seem to be important across the entire application review process. These differences, I think, is where it's more interesting. Again, the curriculum, your transcript, this is curriculum and GPA. So your transcript score and your GPA, very important in the beginning. Once you get to committee, we don't even care about it. We don't look at it. Again, your application never would have made it to committee if we had a concern about your ability to perform well in class. And this is part of the bullet point that I had in an earlier slide that said college admissions committees, they can be more selective now, okay? And so if you can imagine this, why would say, well, I won't name any particular school, but why would a certain, say, top college in committee spend the time and effort trying to evaluate a student that had a below average SAT, had a very underachieving transcript, was not very active in activities, et cetera, or did not evidence a lot of leadership and impact? Why would committee even waste time with that kind of applicant when there's so many other applicants that far exceed that level? Okay, and so that's why, again, there's certain things that weigh very heavily in committee and things that do not weigh heavily in committee. Okay, with that said, a lot of the students I work with, and this is became a whole lot more known in the public media because of the Supreme Court of the United States SCOTUS famous landmark decision. It was Harvard, University of North Carolina, et cetera. I'm not sure if anybody remembers this. This happened a few years ago, but supposedly now colleges are not allowed to consider race. That's why on the scale of less important to more important, race is all the way down here. Because now, according to the Supreme Court, that's law. The reason why this circle is not colored in is because I think there's a caveat to that. For 2 years, or for a year and a half, I was saying, oh, really? Well, let's see what the demographic makeup is of the incoming classes of various schools to see indeed Okay. And, maybe it's coincidental or maybe it's not, but it really hasn't changed that much and it's not expected to change much. Does that say that all the colleges are violating the law? Of course not. Okay. No one ultimately can know what's actually going on inside the committee room. And I'll even say it this far. The only people who know what goes on in the committee room are the 3 people who are voting in committee, or the 5 or the 7 people and so on. Okay. Even the dean of admissions, if the dean is not in that committee room, then even the dean, there's no way the dean can know what is going on in that committee room. Okay. So with that said, a lot of this is, of course, this is why I was emphasizing a lot of these, associations are very helpful, because this is where this is where we actually can talk with each other and just see informally what's going on. And so these are generally the changes, not the level of importance, but the change. So the transcript is still important and it still has its place before committee and afterwards. Standardized testing, as I mentioned earlier, is becoming a little bit more important. Okay, activities definitely becoming more important. Recommendations, essays, and interviews, these are pretty subjective if you think about it. And so I think that these, especially and including this as well, these are becoming more important because they help admissions folks differentiate between candidates. Why then is this becoming more important? We're seeing a lot of colleges are seeing students that have very diverse backgrounds. And so it's becoming harder to compare students when, for example, you have different styles of curriculum. For example, there's so many different kinds of even high schools. So, and I'm not talking about just public and private, but even within public, right? There's magnet, right? There's these, what are they called? They're the unconventional charter schools. And then, of course, you have basis, K-12, IB. You have so many different, forms of schools. And so it's getting hard. You have parochial schools. So I think that's around 6 or 7 different kinds of school. And of course, there's even homeschooling. So there's so many different ways that people are now showing their high school educational background. And so that's what's making some of the standardized testing a whole lot more important. It's the only way for us to do at least some sort of comparison. Okay. I'd say the next data point that I think is very interesting, and this gets a little bit at that SCOTUS race issue. And so this is not intended to have any sort of a socio-economic or political message. This is simply referencing 2 studies that I think are very interesting. And I encourage you to look up these studies on your own if you like. One is from Princeton, and the other one is from the National Study of Colleges, this firm represented by these two researchers. And I think it shows 2 things that are very interesting. Okay, so these are equivalencies. So what that means is, for example, this kind of student needs to score or needed to score here. The white is the older study, the gray is the newer study. So in the past, this kind of student had to score here to be considered equal to this kind of student who scored here, or to this kind of student who scored here, or this kind of student who scored here. Okay. And what has happened now is, I think, the second interesting point, at least according to just these 2 studies, okay, is that this group has to score even higher. If you notice, this gray bar actually gets a little higher now. So that's worse, at least for this group, okay? And there's other groups that actually can score lower just to be more equal. Okay, so that gives you an idea, at least according to these 2 studies, of what an earlier trend has been. I think what would be interesting would be to see if there's either Princeton might, update this study or something, especially in more recent times, especially after the SCOTUS decision. But anyway, I think this is not hiding any sort. I don't think this is, I think I don't think this is altering any sort of notion that a lot of people had anyway. So anyway, as I wrap up this presentation, and I'm anxious to get to questions. So again, Sophia, I'm sorry for going a little bit longer. I want to try to impart a couple of suggestions on what people should do now. So based on these trends, what should you do? Well, before we think about what do we do, what should you know about what's going on? Okay, so a couple things. Colleges differentiate between achievement and accomplishment. Accomplishment is you got something done. Okay, mission accomplished, or did you mow the lawn? Chore accomplished. Achievement is doing something at a very high level. Okay, and so to emphasize both of these, I think is something that's important for you to know how to distinguish, to make sure you can track these things. Okay, the who, what, where, when, how, why you're doing things. I've mentioned how is how resourceful you're doing things, how much initiative you take, how adventurously you do things, how resourcefully, how you do it. I mentioned resourceful. How creatively do you do things? How do you do things in a team setting? Are you always doing things by yourself, or are you doing them with others and so on? Why? Obviously, that's all about motivation. And there are a lot of different kinds of motivation, which I'll talk about in a minute. Pyramid to T-shape. What this gets at is, if you think of a pyramid, what we like to see is early in, say, your high school career, ninth grade to, say, middle school. Okay. Well, middle school is not going to show up in your college application, but I'll talk about if you're a middle schooler right now. But from ninth going to 12th grade, what colleges generally like to see is you had a broad base of experiences, but then you eventually narrowed things down, and you do not have to reach a singularity at the top of your pyramid, but it should be clear to the admissions committee what you are specialized in, what are you good at, what do you like to do, etc. And this eventually gets you to something called a T-shaped student. If you think of the shape of the letter T, this kind of student does everything well across the board, but they specialize very deeply in maybe one or two particular things, or maybe one or just a few, several things. This trend here, or in terms of what you need to know for the future, is what I noticed over the years. I think about maybe 10 years ago or so, I started tracking this. I noticed that it seemed to me a lot of people who vote in committee, they seem to use the same criteria. And so there's about 7 or 8 of these criteria that I've been keeping track of over the years. I think these are 3 of probably the most important. Intrinsic motivation is, why are you doing something on a deeper level rather than just chasing a grade or a trophy or a title, like president or captain, that sort of thing. Intellectualism and utility. Intellectualism and utility are not the same as academic achievement. So intellectualism is simply just how do you think. Utility is all about how do you use what you studied and what you think. And then finally, convergence is how things come together. So suppose you like to volunteer, you have a very kind, compassionate heart. Suppose you speak Spanish. And suppose, you really love robotics. Well, maybe you want to volunteer at a summer camp for robotics for only Spanish-speaking students who are underprivileged. And so that's an example of convergence, things coming together. If you think about people who are successful out in the real world, usually they have converged, okay, in terms of their talents and their skills, okay? And then finally, what should you do now in terms of moving forward? And so this is where I wanted to give a little bit of advice based on the trends that I've noticed. And so if you're a rising senior, focus on how you can demonstrate things. What evidence do you have to show your T? As I mentioned, the T shape. Okay. What is your S3? What are you going to do for your 3rd summer? This is a lot of admissions people call your S1, S2, S3. So these are the 3 summers that you have in high school to really prove things outside of the classroom. And then how do you evidence these things? I mentioned there are about 7 or 8 determinants. I mentioned 3 key ones a minute ago, but how do you actually prove that you've been converging or you have a true intellectual motivation and so on, or intrinsic motivation or true intellectualism, etc. Okay, if you're a 9th or a 10th grader, I would say discovery. The pyramid I just described, okay, go ahead and try different things. Admissions committees generally prefer, or a lot of us believe that the person who says, okay, I think I want to go to medical school, or I think I want to be an engineer or a lawyer or whatever, you arrive at that decision having exposed yourself to a lot of things, as opposed to saying, oh yeah, I knew ever since I was 5 years old that I wanted to be an engineer. Well, how do you know? Well, because that's all I've done. Not a good way to make a decision, at least in the admissions committee's mind. It's not a mature way to think in the admissions committee's mind. It's not an experience-based, prudent way to make a decision about what you think you might want to major in, or what you think your special interests might be, or maybe even what your career interests might be. Challenges, setbacks, and failures. This is a good litmus test, I think. as a ninth or 10th grader, don't be afraid of failing. Usually there's no such thing as quitting. Okay. And if you're not challenging yourself, think about it. A lot of college is not really that interested in that kind of person. Okay. There's some, well, I'll move on. And then growth. Okay. And the growth should be in especially these areas, intellectual and academic growth, two different things, by the way. And then real world in terms of experience and how things go outside of the what a lot of us call the high school bubble or microcosm, and then just personal maturity. If you are a middle schooler right now, what I would encourage, and I do work with actually quite young students. The youngest student I've worked with was a fourth grader, believe it or not. But I encourage you to explore different things. The one thing that, or one of the things that I think is important for any middle schooler to have mastered before you enter high school is to know what kind of academic or what kind of intellectual you see yourself becoming. You know, and I mean, are you more interested in STEM? If so, why? Are you more interested in humanities? If so, why? You'll notice that admissions committees generally don't care that much about what it is you're interested in. Common myth. If this comes up in questions, I'm happy to answer it. But there's no such thing as a college that's looking to populate their department. So the people who think, oh, you know, I want to apply to say a technical school, a technical institute. You know what? There's so many who apply for computer science. I think I'll apply as you know, African American poetry and literature. You know, that'll make me special and have a high chance to get in. It's not the way that works. So instead of trying to game the system, I encourage you to, as a middle schooler, see what kind of, you know, what kind of learner you are, how you study, okay, what you find to be interesting, okay, how are you when things are confusing or challenging? How are you by yourself or in team situations? You know, how are you with different kinds of activities in the STEM to humanities spectrum? Okay, I encourage pre-high school students to not pigeonhole themselves, which means to pick one thing because they love it and stick only with that one thing and they don't want to try anything. Okay, so anyway, if I were to give a final suggestion for what to do now for the future, and this applies really to everyone, but I think at varying degrees, because of course, you know, a sixth grader is a very different stage than a rising 12th grader. But I think this does apply to everyone, which is to master what I've called, at least for now, informally, is a stack, the Ivy stack, the success tools for admission to college. So this stack, if you think about it, stacks up with three main tools, I would say. What I call critical thinking. Critical thinking needs to be communicated, and that's going to be communicated in your writing. It's going to be communicated in your speaking. But the reason why I think writing stacks on top of thinking is because thinking, of course, you can just think of Isaac Newton, as legend has it, under the apple tree, right? You could just sit there all day if you want. Okay. Writing is a little bit more of an iterative process, but you can still ponder things as you write and rewrite draft after draft. Speaking is probably the most extreme. You have to be a critical thinker. You have to be able to communicate as a writer in terms of how you express yourself with diction and your word choice, your phraseology. Okay. But speaking ultimately, I think, is one of the most critical success tools because you can't prepare like you can for writing. You can't do a rough draft in your speaking. Okay. And a lot of studies show that over 80% of communication is nonverbal, and it's not only the words that you use, but how you speak. And so that's why I believe that this stack is one of the best ways, no matter what grade level you're at, to really prepare yourself to eventually show through your transcript, your activities, and they'll show even in your essays and interviews and everything about why you should get into, you know, any certain school. So with that said, Sophia, I apologize for taking too much time. I'm happy to answer some questions if there are any. So should I just hand the shared screen over to you now?
Okay. Yeah, hold on 1 second. Let me share my screen.
Okay. So I will.
Thank you.
Sure thing.
That was very, very good content. I just wanted to follow what you just last start. And I wanted to kind of quickly, before we do Q&A, to let our family to know we are very, very happy to join your guidance and effort to rolling out a critical thinking. Because I have to tell you, I have the privilege to follow many students to your session or some other independent counselor session. And one thing, multiple times, I watch the session going, especially during the application season, when our coach is doing the essay editing, brainstorming with a personal statement. I so much wanted to recording those sessions and then do a documentary. The reason is because I see a lot of the students are very good students. They're doing very high GPAs, have very high standardized tests. But unfortunately, when you're doing that session with them, I feel the idea they wanted to present to put into the personal statement are so shallow. I'm sorry to say that, so shallow. Almost feel like they don't know what is the deep thinking, nor they know what is critical thinking, nor they know what is an interesting point for them to express themselves. So that's why we came to you and asking, knowing you had the experience of doing in the past of hosting the critical thinking class to give students an opportunity. I even mentioned to you, I want some of the parents come to this class with you because I feel the students are coming from a ground of home soil. That soil, if it's not right, they don't have opportunity to think deeply. They don't have opportunity to have the habit of learning critical thinking, which is ultimately, I feel, when you have the student going to competing in the Ivy League school level, top 20, top 15, top 10 school, many parents coming to us saying, my kids want to go into aim for the top 10 school, top 15 school. Ultimately, when we watch it on the side, it's about maturity. We see the kids when they competing in that level, it's almost like a maturity competition. Some of the kids parent to be more mature, they can think. They think on their own feet. They have opinion. They have perspective. They can have that expressed to you. So we feel towards end, when the parents saying what else is matters, my way of thinking is the maturity. So how do you make the kids mature? I feel this is, one way. That's why I wanted to kind of quickly mention, you just, hear Professor Ahn mention about high GPA, high SAT, more and more students doing that. The requirement going higher. So it becomes more difficult, more competitive. The AP also getting harder. The everybody doing independent research competition also become a standardized portfolio, and also all the outside the school activity become more and more number wise, right? So we are lacking of deep thinking. We're lacking of intellectual identity. So I wanted to let all the family know we are going to rolling out a class hosted by Professor Ahn to teach kids in the critical thinking, okay? Because this is so important. Your essay editing become, let's say, more difficult because the kids doesn't have a good ideas. Doesn't matter how much session we're going to brainstorming, we're still not able to develop to a ideal, which is student thinking it's good enough to present in their personal statement. So now I wanted to let all our family know, Professor Ahn is going to have a 12th session of critical thinking program starting in March, right? In March. And that compiled of a session of critical thinking, talk about how to build that way of thinking. And then 2 sessions is apply thinking to writing, and also 2 sessions add on to apply for thinking for speaking, which is Professor Ahn just mentioned about. If you thinking this going to be, especially for the good students, especially for those GPA very, very high student, this is critical. That's like towards end of a final finish line. You're welcome to scan the barcode. And if you're interested in, we will be able to have somebody follow up with you. We only have a student, I'm thinking, we're thinking about 10 students per session. That way, Professor Ahn has a ton of interactive activity going on to make sure every single participants and student have the opportunity to practice, from different angles, right? To practice how to do, the critical thinking and how to writing and speaking. And I am sure, Professor Ahn, I mentioned to you, right? If this is successful for the student, we almost wanted to engage with you again to have a different session for the parents because parents are crucial. Without, be honest with you, I feel parents level the mindset is the ceiling, is the glass ceiling of students' maturity. If the parents doesn't have very deep thinking, then students, I want to say majority times, will stop them for that, environment to help them. So that's our next session. I'm going to, mention that. Okay, I want to also put in here, then we're going to Q&A session. I just want to mention if the parents wanted to have a dialogue with Professor Ahn, feel free to raise your hand. Then I can open up the mic, have you asking questions directly. If you have a question, wanted to, continue put on the chat box, I will read them and Professor Ahn will answer them. If you're thinking you wanted to have a one-on-one 30-minute session with Professor Ahn, you can tell he has pool of experience. He done this for so many years. He know inside and out about how to prepare your child to become someone more competitive. You want to spend your time wisely. You can scan the barcode on the right-hand side. That way somebody will follow up with you so you can schedule 30 minutes one-on-one session with Professor Ahn. If you want to just kind of stay in put to knowing every single month what we're going to share with you on the knowledge base, just to learn. If you think your child's still young, you wanted to also still watching and also see what's going on, then you could scan the barcode on the left-hand side. That way, we also will be able to inform you within our WeChat group. Okay, then let's go to the information. Professor, I'm going to read some of the question for you, and then you can answer that. And like I said, any parents, if you're thinking you wanted to have a more dialogue, then feel free to raise your hand. Okay. Okay. First question from June Wang: which university have interviews, and which one don't?
Right. Well, there's 6,000 colleges, so the easiest way to answer that is just to look it up. But that answer is not going to help you either because it can change for this upcoming cycle. So that's number one. So number two, it's a bit of an odd question because you should assume that there will be an interview. Number three, you should hope that there's an interview. So if you ever get an invitation, it's always optional. Do not reject that offer. Okay. So as a matter of fact, you need to understand that if you are asked for an interview and you reject it, that alone is going to hurt your application. I believe it will probably end your application. Okay. So that's the third thing about the interview. And then the fourth thing is you should be at a stage where you're articulate enough, your oratorical skills are good enough, your poise and confidence, all of your nonverbals should be at a mature enough level so that you would interview well anyway. To me, the fifth and last thing I'll say to that is it's a little bit of an odd question or mindset, in my opinion, at least, because the interview is becoming more important. The subjectivity is becoming more important for differentiating people. If it's not an interview, some schools are now switching to videos, etc. Some are doing selective interviews. And so you should not gamble. You should not think, well, I think most of my colleges that I will be applying to, they did not interview last cycle. So I'm not going to worry about my speaking or my interviewing skills. I think that's a bad and a risky strategy.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next question from Ho Huang. Do they compare students from different grades within the same school or compare them to students from previous years?
I'm not exactly sure if I understand the question, but I'm assuming it means does the admissions criteria change from each cycle to each cycle? We call them cycles, but for each season, each year. And so the answer to that is no. Okay. So, and the reason for that is for most of the school, at least for the colleges I'm most familiar with, that becomes a moot point because the quality of the applicant pool has continued to become more competitive. The quality has risen, and the size of the applicant pool is getting larger. So there's no reason for a college to downgrade their criteria when they're evaluating applicants. If anything, the criteria continues to go higher and higher. The second answer to that is generally colleges are focusing on, of course, a lot of data points, but two of them are how many people are accepted, and of those, how many people are going to say yes. Okay, so the acceptance rate and the yield rate. So those are two things that colleges are very keen on targeting. Okay, and so what they'll do is pick of, say, and I'm not going to name any particular school, but suppose there's an Ivy League school and they have a quota of accepting 3,000 candidates. Okay, so they're going to accept 3,000. They're not going to lower their admissions criteria just to get the 3,000. But the reasoning is as I mentioned earlier, they don't have to, because again, when the applicant pool is becoming better, more competitive, and larger, the only way for that criteria to change is to go up. So there's no reason for us to look backwards.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. If we don't understand your question, any audience, you can also obviously raise your hand. I will give you opportunity to clarify your question because I know sometimes when you're typing may not be exactly, but they do compare, right? They do compare same grade student, meaning
The
the
same
student
grade,
coming
yeah.
from, yes, the student
Yeah.
coming from same school will be compared as a group
Oh,
to evaluating,
oh,
right?
I see. Oh, okay. Actually, if that's the interpretation of the question, there's a couple answers to that. Number one, in general, no, which means there's no quota for how many students from what school. Okay. Number two, that data is tracked, but that's usually what we call lagging, not leading data. What that means is lagging, which means after we've evaluated the application, then we may look at, oh, are these, do we have 30 students from the same school or something? Then we look at that. Okay. And then the third thing is generally speaking, we don't limit it by saying, for example, oh, suppose you go to one of the 10. Those are Phillips Academy, Phillips Andover, Hotchkiss, Deerfield, those schools, Lawrenceville, et cetera. They don't look at the school and say, we're going to take only 10 students from that school, 5 students from that school, and 2 from that. There's no limit or quota that's that arbitrary. So yes, it's tracked, but it's lagging more than leading.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Okay. The next question coming from Stacy, is there any minimum cutoff GPA for each college before getting to a committee? If so, do they look at a weighted or unweighted GPA? Do you have any example for some colleges?
Yeah, so the answer is yeah, unfortunately, yes and no. I've heard of many colleges that actually have a minimum cutoff in the first filtering stage. And if it's way too low, for example, if it's in the 4th quartile, then your application's over. Okay, that's number one. Number two, a safe cutoff would be 3.65, generally speaking. Okay. Number three, everybody looks at weighted and unweighted. We also, if possible, will look at how many the population of the high school. Some colleges I've heard will also, if possible, they'll try to find out what the valedictorian's GPA is. So a lot of times, they may ask for class rank. A lot of times it's not available either. But we'll take any data point that we can so that at least we can see where that student performs within that environment. But keep in mind, that's not as important as the standardized testing. So let me give you a couple examples. There are some high schools that there are probably around 40 or 50 high schools that actually have, I'll say, unofficially, a reputation of something called grade inflation. That means that everybody's grade is high. And I'm not saying it's all private schools, but imagine your parents spend a lot of money, you go to a fancy school, and the grades are low. You might be unhappy compared to if the grades are high. And so again, this is unofficial, but it's a little strange if everyone has a perfect GPA, but the AP exam scores are all 3 or 2. Okay. Or everyone's grades are so high in honors and advanced class, but their SAT is, 1100. Okay, that's a little bit strange. So the GPA, you should simply, if you're performing well or not, if it's inflated or not. But regardless, it's important, but it's not as important as other data points.
Makes sense. Thank you. Next one from Gloria One. Does ACT score of 1550 versus 1570 or 1580 make a meaningful difference in an admission officer's eyes?
No. So those are SAT scores. So the reason being, and think of it this way, the ranges are such that, once you're at a certain level, we feel like, okay, combined with your transcript and your other standardized testing scores. So for example, suppose you took a national exam or you took some APs and so on, or say you're in an IB program or you're in a basis or K-12 program, as long as we get the sense that you can do the work, you can perform well, you have a minimum or you have a certain level of aptitude, academic aptitude, then that's fine. So that's the reason why for a lot of people who I've worked with students, they got a 1520 and they just got to get that 1600. That's about 3, depending on the year, that's about 3 questions that you need to get correct. 3 more questions. Sometimes only 2 questions to get more correct. The admissions committee doesn't think, oh, because you answer 3 more questions, oh, you're a different person now, and we really want you. And that's not the way we think. And so, 2 or 3 questions, that kind of thing isn't going to make a difference. The second point I'll say also is we look at things holistically. Okay, so again, we look at more than just the SAT, ACT, et cetera. And then the third thing I'll say is there are 2 types of interpretations there's one with a high score and one with a low score. And what that means is if you suppose you score low on the SAT, or you feel it's low, but you have other evidence that you are still an outstanding student, okay, that is possible. So a lot of admissions people think it's possible you can be very intelligent, but you just maybe had a bad day or bad days and you didn't score well on the SAT. The other interpretation is generally not possible. And what that means is if you score high, suppose you make a 1580, okay, so in the admissions committee's mind, you cannot be stupid and accidentally score 1580. Okay, so that means if you're a 1580, if you're that level of a student, then holistically, the rest of your application should look like that too. So the strange thing is we would rather have someone, perhaps they had something in the mid 1400s, but the transcript also showed that, they had some 5s, maybe a 4 here and there, but they were challenging themselves. We'd rather see that than someone who had a 1580 and they just took on-level or honors courses and they got A's, or they picked the wrong courses. There's certain AP courses that should be selected. There are some AP courses that should not be selected because in the admissions committee's minds, there's certain categories of courses that are more meaningful than others, and some are meaningful in a negative way. So that course selection becomes important too. Again, it's holistic though. So you're thinking only of the ACT or SAT, I think is a little bit risky.
Yeah, on that note, Professor Ahn, like our college application constantly, we do school selection, course selection is one of very big component of what you're coaching student, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. The second part of question from that same person is a sophomore gets 1550, which is 800 math. Is it worth retaking, or is time better to spend on research or other, area?
Yeah, I'll just say no, it's not worth retaking for the same reason. You need to answer a 1550. Again, you need to answer 2, maybe 3 more questions, and then you'll have a 1600. Doesn't make any difference to us.
Okay. Okay, excellent. From C. Yang Chen, sorry, bad reception in the past couple of minutes. Can you explain what is a T and what is the S3?
S3 is simply the 3rd summer. Yeah. S2 is the 2nd summer. S1 is the 1st. So the way we think of your high school career, your application you have your 9th, 10th, 11th grade, and then you have a summer in between each one of those. So S1, S2, S3. And so we look for different things depending on which summer it is. The T, and that's somewhat related to your T. So a T, if you just think about the shape of a T, so it means you do everything well because you have a good attitude, you're smart, you have leadership, you work hard, you just have a lot of good qualities about yourself. But there's one thing that you do very deeply, very specially. It doesn't have to be only one thing. Maybe it's two, maybe it's even three things. But the whole point is you do everything well, but there's something that you do deeply.
Excellent. Thank you. Next question from Lin Zhu is, what is the typical GPA to go through the first part? First part, you mean the first GPA, first semester, or?
Right. So again, it's going to vary per college. So for your Ivies, they are going to be pretty high. What you should do is you should look at the mid tile, which is the the second and the third quartiles, and see what the range of the GPAs are. You should do the same with the SAT or ACT as well. But for the GPAs, like I said, 365 should be a minimum. Okay. And then a lot of, for example, I won't tell you which school it is, but one of the Ivies loves to talk about how 10% of their incoming class every year was either a valedictorian or salutatorian in their respective high school. A lot of them also like to talk about how one of the colleges likes to talk about how 15 to 20% of all their incoming students have scored in the top percentile of the SAT and ACT. That's in addition to those mid-tile statistics that every college shows on their website. So like I said, it's going to vary per college, but those are the minimums.
Okay, great. Thank you, Professor Ahn. Okay, from CL, with respect to summer program between CIEE and YYGS, which one would you recommend?
Oh, either one of those is going to be fine. So that's number one. Number two, what you do with those programs is much more important. So for example, a lot of people just go to they go to Yale, and then they pick which category that they're going to do their research, their project in. They give the presentation, and then they're done. Okay. If that's all you do, then that's not going to that's actually going to show very negatively. That number two, getting in. So, number one is which program you necessarily go to isn't going to make that much of a difference. It's really what you do with it. Okay. Number two, there's only a few programs, depending on your your specialty area, what your interest is, that can sometimes catch the notice of your admissions officer or the person who's scoring your activities. So for example, if you're on the humanities side, if you do, Columbia writing, or you do, Kenyon writing or something, or you go, NYU Film School, there's certain, summer programs. On the STEM side, if you do RSI or you do SSP, or there's, MIT Primes, there's certain other programs that do catch our eye because we know how competitive they are. But in general, I wouldn't worry too much about the program itself. I know YYGS, and there's a lot of other. My school, for Wharton alone, we have 5 summer camps. Yeah, they're competitive, or they feel very competitive because you have to write essays, you have to do teacher recommendations, submit your transcript, etc. Some of the schools now even are required. We're thinking about requiring interviews now. Okay, so it's getting pretty competitive. Okay, but the point is just because you get in doesn't really mean anything. It's what you do at that program. So that's I think the second point I was making. The third point I'm making is there are a lot of applicants who get accepted and they don't go anywhere. A lot of times they can't afford it. A lot of these programs are expensive. Look at, again, I won't name which Ivy, but there's one Ivy in particular who's very known for accepting a lot of homeschool students. One of the other Ivies gives more money than any other they're tied for the top 5 colleges that give away more money for stipends and grants, etc., for underprivileged kids. A lot of these kids, they can't even go to YMCA summer camp. Okay. So the real issue is what are you doing with your S1, S2, S3? That's what we really care about. So the how and the why is a whole lot more important. I can give some anecdote. Well, we don't have time to tell you stories, but there are some amazing applicants, and they couldn't afford to go anywhere or do anything. But what they did And they're small town, amazing. Everybody voted yes for these applicants. And so I wouldn't worry so much about which program you go into. Worry more about what you do when you get there. And so, stay in touch with your professor. Go explore the rest of the college. Go sit in on another classroom that's having their summer session. Go suggest another project, outside of the project that you're already been assigned. Go, create some new event with another, say, team that's doing some work in another area besides yours. There's a lot of those kinds of opportunities that are there, but they're missed. And so those are the things that'll really differentiate you.
Thank you. The next question, I think, taking really to the home from Li Yingzhang, which is, I think, I want you to share with more. And I do see a lot of Asian students are in that category. If a student are shy, not good at speaking, what kind of class or activity as a parents can recommending to a student?
Okay, so number one, shy is not introverted. So being introverted just means one is not outwardly expressive, and that's fine. A lot of people are not outwardly expressive. Number two, there's no one set personality that you need. Okay. Number three, shy means you're not outwardly expressive because you don't have a lot going on in your head. Introverted means you have a lot going on in your head, but maybe you're just not outwardly expressive. Okay, so number one, so the third point I'll say is make sure you're introverted, not shy. The fourth thing that I'll say in terms of activities or things, of course, there's things like debate, Model UN, mock trial, drama theater, there's Toastmasters. There's so many speaking things that you can do, and that's fine. I really applaud that someone would want to do that. But the real thing is just to, if you enjoy speaking, that's going to show in everything that you do. It'll show up in your teacher recommendation letters. It'll show up in the kinds of activities you do. It'll even show up in the kind of awards that you get. And I'm not talking about getting first speaker in a debate tournament or that kind of thing. I'm just saying, if you are awarded a citizenship award for volunteering, clearly you're going to be a good speaker. So I wouldn't worry so much about a particular activity or award or camp or something like that. So that's the other point. And then the final other point I would say is, in terms of the speaking, that's something that I think should come naturally, especially if you're not a rising 12th grader. That's something you have time to develop more confidence in your poise, as well as showing the way that you think is going to be reflected a lot of ways in the way that you speak. And if you're not a rising 12th grader now, you should assume that interviews or the way that you present yourself, okay, in the way you speak, is eventually going to become even more important than it already is.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, next one is, hi, Professor Ahn. My daughter is in 10th grade. She has good GPA. However, she doesn't have any particular interest in STEM or liberal arts subject. Any suggestions?
Sure. There's two kinds of undecided. Okay. The bad undecided is I have no interest or I don't have any idea what I'm interested in because I've never really explored anything. That's the bad undecided. The good undecided is, well, I have no idea what I'm interested in between poetry, literature, newspaper, computer, robotics, debate, math, because I've tried all the, I have no idea what I'm interested in. That's the good kind of undecided. So if she's in 10th grade, it's fine that she doesn't, not everyone necessarily has to have a T or a pyramid, depending on the way the rest of their application looks. So that's number one. So that's holistic. Number two, be the good undecided, not the bad. Okay. Number three, in order to be the good kind of undecided, that means you were busy trying things out. Okay. And so for you, it's like going to a buffet saying, oh, I don't like any of the food. Well, what did you try? Nothing? Well, then we're not interested in that. But if you tried a lot of things and you're still undecided, that's fine. Your Ivy League schools, remember traditionally, these are the 8 Ivies. Historically and traditionally, we all, and I can say this confidently because we all meet quite frequently. And I'll say that in a lot of different contexts. But I will say that I think this is not only the same, but I think it has become even more ingrained amongst the Ivies and a lot of other schools where they want you to come and explore. So you may have a T-shape. You may be interested in, say, biochemical research or maybe in, classical literature or whatever it is you're interested in, but we still want you to come and explore. So if you notice some of the applications, one of the Ivy League applications, they ask you to choose what 3 majors might you want to study. Okay. There's another Ivy League school, and they say, which of these activities do you think you might want to do, and rank what level you think you might want to participate in. And that ranks from a lot to a little and so on. So the colleges, we want you to come and explore. I'll share a quote that comes from one of the Ivy League admissions committee rooms. And she told me that what they say is, like, every time they come across an applicant who seems like they know exactly what they want to do, they say, great, another 17-year-old who thinks they have the whole world figured out. Why do they need to come to our school then? Okay, so a little bit of that undecided is perfectly fine.
Thank you. That's great. That's a great answer. Okay, next one I think is very good. I'm glad SL asking for. Can you speak more about critical thinking class? Like, what are the content? What type of student? Junior or senior? Is it more lecture based or more group discussion? How many students and what is the schedule like?
Okay. So there's a lot of questions in there. So I think that how many students and the schedule, that's driven more by IvyCompass, but I think it was 9 or 10. And the schedule is, I think, 90-minute sessions. I'm sure there'll be a break here and there. But there's no lecture or discussion. It's all interactives. Okay, so I'm asking you questions or you're asking me questions. You're figuring out problems or I'm helping you how to show how you figure out problems. And there are a lot of different approaches. I'm sure a lot of high school students, even though the parents may not have heard of different methods, but there are algorithmic methods, sequential thinking, there's Socratic seminar. There's a lot of different ways. There's Boolean logic. There's a lot of different approaches for critical thinking. I can also, so that's the second part. The third part, I think part of the question was in terms of maybe an example of what exactly is critical thinking? Because I get that question a lot. Like, what do you actually teach? Like, what is the critical thinking? So there are a lot of different kinds of it, but a lot of it has to do with the depth at which you analyze things and then how you inquire about things. So the depth, for example, would be something like, might be, oh, so Apple is selling more and more iPhones. Is that a good or a bad thing? Well, let's analyze that. Let's think about that critically. Okay, so they're selling more phones. Okay, well, what does that mean? Are they pricing them higher or are they selling more of the phones? Well, is it possible that Apple is making more money by selling fewer phones? Of course it is, if the price goes high enough. Is it possible that Apple is making more money even if they sell at a lower price? Of course it is, if they sell more of these. Well, suppose they are making more money by lowering the price and selling more. What effect might that have long term? Does it cheapen the product? Does it make some customers more sensitive? Does it make other customers want to delay their purchase? Oh, they want to delay, and then let's dig into one of those. They want to delay their purchase. Why do they want to delay their purchase? In other words, why are they buying? Is it for aesthetic reasons, for utility? Is it because they're doing something called sandbagging? Okay, well, what if it's for utility? And then again, you just keep digging deeply instead of just taking something on the surface level. And then the second area of critical thinking has a lot to do with questioning. And a lot of that is just creativity. A lot of it has to do with creativity, but it's mostly rooted in what's called intellectual curiosity. Okay, and so intellectual curiosity has something to do with, for example, I don't know, the person asked this question. When's the last time you thought about, let me think of an example. Think about milk. Okay, so everybody drank milk or drinks milk, so what? Okay, well, think about the first person who drank milk the very first time. Okay, so they're maybe sitting on a farm. They see some really big animal, some big cow, and then they look underneath and they go, you see that thing under there? I'm going to squeeze it and see what comes out. And then some white stuff comes out, and then that person says, I wonder what will happen if I drink it. And so this is what I mean by asking questions about things that maybe people might not normally ask questions about. So it's a certain kind of intellectual curiosity, okay, that can lead to something else. So that might be kind of a silly example, but hopefully it's something that you can remember, and it'll give you an example of what the ways that we inquire about things.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. There's a couple questions on that. I just want to also mention, this session is for 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th student because when you get to 11th, they will be very busy getting to almost the application season. So this class is aiming for 7th to 10th grade student together, as one class. Because it's training way of thinking, so that could be suitable. If we have a lot more students, then maybe in the future we can divide them to a younger age or older, a little bit older high school student. Okay, good. There's still a lot of questions, Professor. I don't think we can finish everything.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm thinking maybe if because I apologize, I'm over the time I was allotting, so maybe one or two more questions if possible.
Okay.
Hmm.
Okay, let me just choose some because there's so many come in. Why Harvard asking what percentage you are going to change majors? Do they want you uncertainty about what you're going to do? I don't know if you answered that question.
Yeah, okay, so I mentioned that there's one Ivy that does ask what are some of the things you're going to do and what's the likelihood or your percent of involvement. So that's Harvard. So Harvard also is asking about your potential majors, at least this year and the last 2 years, they've been asking that. So that's number one. Number two, they do like to know, they like to keep track of what the levels of interest are in certain departments. Okay. The other thing is they also like to have some sense of what what's called an ancillary interest might be. So ancillary interest is something that's closely related to your initial choice. For example, you might say you're interested in biology, but then an ancillary interest might be neuroscience. Okay, you're interested in say, applied math, and now you're interested in say econometrics or something. So they do like to, some colleges, especially Harvard, they do like to keep track of what your ancillary interests might be as well. But I will say this, the two people that I know pretty well at Harvard in terms of the admissions process, they are similar to the other Ivies in that they're not looking to populate their departments. Harvard is not worried that they're not going to get enough qualified applicants for their departments in terms of majors. They're not worried about that, but they do like to track it. So again, that's what we call more of a lagging indicator than a leading one. So in other words, if you pick a high or low percentage, they're not going to reject or accept you because of that. Okay, so that would be a leading, but it's not a leading indicator, it's a lagging one. So after you do it, they just like to keep track of what that is.
Okay, there's a question I'm thinking, what's good can be. What do you look for course selection? Do you mean meaningful or not meaningful? I think that question may be not as okay. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit about course categories in admission office are weighted more than others?
Yeah, so the course selection is actually very important, mostly to show two things, your interests, but also more your interest slash how much you experiment. And then second and more important is how much you challenge yourself. The second point I'll say is the course selection is not viewed in isolation. Usually it's viewed in the context of your standardized test score, your SAT, and then sometimes even your teacher recommendation letter. So I can give a quick example because a lot of people just think, well, let me just pick as many AP courses as possible. That's a very bad strategy. I'll give you an example. Suppose you're a STEM student. Suppose you took BC Calculus as a 10th or 11th grader. Well, that's great. You have no business taking AP statistics. Your transcript reviewer, we will immediately know that you're wasting your time. You are doing what we call padding your GPA, which means that you want to get an easy A. Because anyone who took BC Calculus as a 10th or 11th grader can teach themselves AP statistics. So you should not pick that, okay? If you're interested in business, you should not be taking AP economics. You should self-study for that one, okay, and take a dual enrollment elsewhere. If you're interested in, say, say in literature, you should not take dual enrollment in ELA, English Language Arts, or AP, literature or composition. Okay, you should take if you do the dual enrollment, we all know that you're just wasting your time and it's an easy A. Okay, so I suggest number one, you know in your heart if you're challenging yourself, and then also if you are not diverse enough in your selections. Usually the school requires you to take a certain variety of courses, even if they are all AP. So you don't usually have to worry too much about being too narrow in your course selection. Being too narrow in your course selection, sometimes that occurs with, like I said, the like the basis K-12. Sometimes some of your IB schools or the parochial schools, some of those schools, when you have too much freedom to choose the courses you want to do, and then we look at a transcript and all you picked was nothing but chemistry and related courses, and that's it, that's going to hurt you, okay? Unless you're applying, I suppose, only to a certain, school that focuses on a certain area of STEM and so on. So that's another point about the course selection. And then the last other thing I'll say is to make sure that you're challenging yourself in your courses. And if you are, they show up in your activities and a lot of times in your teacher recommendation letters. So suppose you make an A in pre-calculus, okay, but then you take AB instead. Well, you have two choices. Well, you really only have one choice. If you are forced to take AB, then you need to write about that in the section in the application that talks about additional information. Okay. Otherwise, your transcript reviewer is going to assume two things about you. This is the student who got an A in pre-calculus, and now you're taking AB, or you're taking AP statistics or something like that. They're going to think two things about you. You're lazy and you're afraid, okay? You're lazy because anyone who got an A in pre-calculus can make at least B plus in BC calculus, okay? So if you don't take BC, you're lazy, okay? And then also you're afraid because you're afraid of getting the B plus instead of an easy A and AB, okay? So that's why, again, how course selection can link to other courses. If you took honors chemistry and then now you're going to take AP chemistry, a lot of times that's going to hurt you too, okay? Because you probably should have taken AP chemistry to start with, or if you took honors chemistry, now you should take something like AP biology or maybe AP physics 1, 2, or C instead of AP chemistry, because now, again, you come across as lazy and afraid. So the course selection a lot of times can have a big impact, irrespective of even the subject matter. Yeah. So with that, I hope that answered that question, Sophia. I'm sorry. I wish I could. These are such good questions. I wish I could go on all night, but I can't.
I know there's a lot of questions. Just one more then. Last
Okay.
one. I allow one parents raise hand for a while now. TJL. Now
Thank
you
you.
open mic. You can speak.
Yes, thank you, Sophia, and thank you, Professor Ahn. I'm just curious, in terms of taking AP classes, is it okay to take a bunch of AP classes without taking all the AP exams? The reason is because the student wants to explore and just learn different things, but knowing that she may not get 5s in all of them. So is it okay, or is it a red flag?
It's an absolute red flag. So make sure that student does not do that. This is the way that there's someone called a transcript reviewer who's going to look at the transcript and the standardized test score. Usually it's the same person. And having done this, having looked at reviewed so many transcripts, et cetera, myself, like thousands, there's a very standard way to interpret a lot of situations. As you can imagine, there's no situation that we've never seen. Okay, so that situation shows usually, oh, they're afraid. Here's the way we interpret it. If it's a strong student and they would have done well, would they choose to take the AP exam? Of course they would. If they knew they were going to get a 5, of course they would take it. If they knew they would do badly, of course they would not take it. If they think they might do somewhere in between, then they should just study harder and then they'll do well. So those are the 3 basic interpretations of someone who's taking an AP course. So if they take the AP course and they do not take the exam, then usually that gets interpreted very negatively. The ideal is the student does not take the AP course, but they do take the AP exam. So there's certain subjects where that shows very well. I usually, with high school students I work with, I make specific recommendations, especially for the ones where that shows well and it's relatively easy. Okay, if you've never taken calculus, it's very, very difficult to study by yourself to get a 5 on the AP physics 1, 2, or even C. Okay, but say, for example, a foreign language is an easy example, okay, where you may take the foreign language level 1, 2, and 3, and suppose you're in 3 honors. That's a great opportunity to self-study and take the AP, say Spanish, so you get Spanish 3 honors, and then go ahead and just study for yourself and take the AP Spanish exam. There are even some strategies, I don't have time to get into it now, but where you can register for the AP exam as a rising senior, but the admissions, we don't get the scores. The scores come out, after, way after the decisions are made. So then why should you still sign up for that? That's a longer story than I have time to explain. But the whole point, though, bottom line, if you take the AP course, you really should be taking the AP exam.
Great. Just quick follow-up. If you take, say, 12 AP classes, but if you get a bunch of 5s, but some 4s, is that also a red flag?
No, that's not a red flag, but it also depends on what the course is in and what else did you do. If you got, say, a 5 in your calculus, and then you got a 3 on your physics 1, your AP physics 1, well, what else have you been doing with your physics 3? Who else is the teacher recommender? What, have you been doing any competitions? Did you go to any summer camp? Do you have a patent? Are you in robotics? There's so many, this is what I meant by the holistic process. I worked with a student, she failed her AP biology course unweighted. Weighted, it was barely passing. She got a 2 on the AP biology exam, okay? But we worked out a strategy. She got into her Ivy. I'm not saying that, I have the magic solution, but obviously what we did with her application worked because it wasn't such a red flag that she got rejected. So even if there's a negative scenario, there's a way to take advantage of what this word holistic means. We look at everything together. That's why, in the 80s, if you got a perfect score on the SAT, it almost didn't matter what else you did. You just got accepted by most of the Ivies. It's not like that anymore. We look at everything together now. So imagine someone failing AP biology, you got a 2 on the exam. So how can you cover that up? So that's what IvyCompass and I work on. Anyway, right. I hope that helps. Sophia, I apologize, but I really do have to
Got it. Yeah, before I was thinking there's one question really, really good. Just before you go, let me squeeze in. This question, I think, will be explaining why we engage you to do the critical thinking class. The question is really good. How would critical thinking class prepare students for the college essay writing, interview, or science project preparation? What is the time expectation for the per week, including class time, homework, if any? When you're mentioning the class for parents, would it be same class or different one for parents?
Okay, just real quickly, the class time I think is 90 minutes. The homework isn't going to be more than about 30 minutes to an hour. Thirdly, it's not so much homework. The nature of the question tells me even the way this person is thinking about what critical thinking is. Critical thinking is it's changing the entire way you think of things. This is not like you're going to take a lesson and then a month later you can play the violin, or now you know how to do derivatives. It's not that kind of course. This is something in 10 sessions. It could take 1,000 sessions, but you need to think of how you're changing the way you think. And then the fourth and last thing I'll say is the way you think shows up in everything that you do. For example, in your essay writing, if you don't know the difference between large and big, or quick and fast, or the difference between precise and accurate, then you're already not thinking in the way that's a critical high level for writing essays. When you speak, okay, the way that you structure your comment is going to reveal how you think. So that's why the speaking is part. This person asked about essays, so I talked about the writing, but the speaking also reflects the way that you think. If I ask you, what's your favorite flavor of ice cream? And you say, oh, chocolate. That's fine. Okay. But that tells me how you think. What you really should have said is, my favorite flavor of ice cream? Well, sometimes it depends. If it's a hot summer day, I like chocolate. If it's winter, I like strawberry. If I'm happy, I like, swirl. If I'm sad, I like, chocolate with nut, and so on, right? So it's not telling you how to think or to complicate the way you're thinking, but it's really to change the entire way you go about thinking of everything. And then that shows in your writing and in your speaking. It's also going to show in your classwork at school, your activities and competitions. It definitely shows up in the teacher recommendation letters. So if I had time, I would share some comments from teacher recommendations, what teachers say about students. The student picks the teacher thinking, oh, I made a high grade and the teacher likes me because we always say hello. But then that letter actually ends up being very negative because of the way that student shows how they think in class, the kinds of questions they ask in class, okay, the kinds of comment, or maybe the lack of comment, that shows up in the teacher recommendation. So this person who asked the question about how does it show up in the college essay or, anything about activities and things, that's too narrow and shallow of a way of thinking about what, at least I've taught this critical thinking now several times, and what I try to achieve has nothing to do with in 10 sessions, you're done and now you know how to do it.
Yeah.
That's the reason why I don't target, I target, the younger students in terms of how you go about thinking of things. And then that's going to manifest in everything you do. So anyway, yeah. Okay. Well, Sophia, thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry I can't go further. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. You maybe I stay on to give some more explanation. You're welcome to drop off. And thank you very much for tonight. Again, wonderful content and also a lot of insight. Appreciate your time.
For having me. Okay. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Good night,
All right. Talk to you soon. Okay. Thanks. Bye. 我稍微 stay on 一点点哈，然后那个还有可以回答一些家长的问题，about critical thinking，我们为什么 engage Professor Ahn 去跟大家有这个机会？首先我当然认为家长的这个 critical thinking 更加的重要，因为我们家长是一个非常重要的土壤来 prepare 和 leading 和影响我们的孩子有 critical thinking。我非常想告诉您，因为我们非常有这个优势，像我们的团队一直陪伴孩子们跟导师们一起做这个 college application 的 coaching。我们最后都发现，能不能冲到从这个所谓的小藤到大藤之间的差异，很多是在于这个孩子的 material。带没有带一些自己的这个深入思考，我们依然有很多很好的 A student， 但他们的想法就是非常 shallow， 很浮在面上，很浮在这个表面，怎么都深入不下去。最后你的这个 essay 不是 about how beautiful your English is， it's not about how grammar is all correct。老师在有这个方式方法来 probing。有的时候都没有办法帮助一个学生去 leading to 一个 thoughtful 的一个点，去做一个 self-reflection 的 personal statement。所以最后拼不拼到最好的这个 top 10 school、15 school， 像我们家长希望孩子学习成绩好，他们就真的觉得应该去拼一下那个top 15 school。那么我要告诉你 critical thinking 就是你的这个 barrier。因为可能很多家长可能还不知道，因为连我们大人很多时候，因为我们的这个文化就是比较吹捧，就是或者比较习惯于去表达我们的孩子很乖，有的家长就跟我们说，哎呀，我们家儿子很乖呀，但是这个乖怎么个表达出来？常常在我们的工作岗位上，还在我们的这个所谓的申请的这个道路上面，就非常凸显了。这个凸显在于我们没有自己的想法，我们没有自己的观点。那么我们为什么作为 IvyCompass 我们这么重视？因为这是我们的 core value， 我们的 core value 就是希望孩子获得全方面的成熟和成长，所以我们会看到这个非常痛心的一个怎么说呢，一个 factor。我们就希望能够在高中期间早一点 engage Professor Ahn，来让他就是给我们做一个这样的一个 attempt，显然像他说的，不是10个 session 你就变成很会 thinking 了，很会想了，所以我当时跟他讲的是先给学生开，因为学生是马上要要升学，对，要这个辅导过程要去 conquer 这个升学的这个下一步的这个目标。但是我其实更认为家长的这个 critical thinking 是更重要的，而且我们不知道怎么在家庭去创造这样的环境，或去自己做一些学习以后，用这样的方式方法去引导我们孩子做一个深入的思考。所以我这边在 Professor 上这个召集时间下去以后，我再花那么几分钟时间来强调一下 why we doing this，what's the purpose，they show everything。 会 throughout application showing 很多地方会成为我们的这个 ceiling，所以我现在就是想urge一下，就是你首先让孩子来尝试一下，希望他能改变他的想法，帮助他能够 thinking，然后下一步，如果家长们有这个兴趣，欢迎您给我们留言啊，给我们这个在这个微信上面、微信群里头还怎么样表达一下你们有这个兴趣。那么如果我们有8个人、10个家长感兴趣的话，那我们就去 engage。Professor 再给我们家长开一个，因为我觉得家长比学生更重要啊！因为我真的是作为一个观察者，我自己本身也是 executive，我感觉孩子们能不能最后走到那个优秀的下一步，我们家长就是他的天花板啊！我们家长的认知如果不到达那个 level 的话，孩子们真的是会就是don't have room to grow，像小苗一样哈。所以我就抱歉哈，多说几句，非常感谢大家今天晚上的陪伴啊！如果要是您觉得 Professor 对您是有帮助的，你可以扫描右边的二维码。跟他做一个30分钟的1对1的这样的一个咨询啊，他是一个非常棒的导师，非常 sharp，很直接。但是呢，这个如果您觉得，哎，我还在观察，您扫描左边的二维码，就在我们的群里。这样的话，我们不断的在每个月都会有好的内容，会有比较 target 的内容，希望帮助到大家会推出。所以感谢大家今天晚上的陪伴，大家周末愉快。再一次感谢那个幕后的这个燕玲的支持和 Allison 的支持。那么谢谢大家陪伴我们，我们下个星期或下个月再见，再见，晚安。